to all of you for being here. Thank you. And excited to talk about this program with two really amazing speakers that are going to be coming up behind me. I'm going to go ahead and get things started though. So my name is Kim Porter. I'm the executive director of Be a Part of the Conversation. We're coming up on our 12th anniversary, which is hard to believe, but here we are talking about alcohol and underage drinking. So we have this as part of a grant with the Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol, who've been a longtime partner of ours. So thank you to them. So after I give you some foundational information, we're going to hear from a couple of really great presenters. We have Jill Adams with us, who's the executive director of Onward Behavioral Health, and she covers a lot of areas of Onward Behavioral Health, which I'm sure she can tell you more about. And we also have Heather Powers with us, who is a person in recovery. And I'm so grateful that you are both here, and hearing a personal story, but especially I think is so meaningful and helpful to reduce the stigma and help you understand that all these numbers that I'm going to throw at you, there are people behind them. There are people that are affected by this. So as I mentioned, April is Alcohol Awareness Month. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this because what I think we miss a lot of the time, alcohol has become so normalized in our culture, but it is a psychoactive substance. It is something that is a depressant, and it doesn't always feel like that. If you're feeling like you're using alcohol to celebrate or to be in a very upbeat situation, it doesn't feel like it's a depressant, but it actually is chemically. That is what happens to us. It definitely can relax. So maybe the inhibitions are lowered. That's part of what feels good, I'm sure. And then there's that dopamine hit. But there are a lot of things that can come with alcohol use that aren't so pleasant. So alcohol doesn't just affect the liver. We all know about cirrhosis and the risk of heavy alcohol use to the liver. By the way, I want to say a lot of what I'm going to give you, the information I'm going to give you initially here, doesn't seem to be about underage drinking, but there's a reason that I want to share all this with you. It's important that we understand the long-term effects of alcohol, the implications of alcohol use especially if it starts to progress into alcohol use disorder. And then we're going to kind of talk about how this all gets started. So yes, the liver is one organ that can be impacted, but also the brain. I mean, just the impairment piece for the short term, but there are also long-term connections that are impacted. Our heart can be impacted if heavy alcohol use has been going on for some time. Cardiomyopathy and the other challenges that aren't always necessarily considered. Pancreas can absolutely be impacted. Pancreatitis is something that some people who use alcohol heavily have experienced. We had another person in recovery share her story of alcohol use disorder and had developed pancreatitis. And not even before she was 30 years old, she was told if she ever drank again, that pancreatitis would probably kill her. So it's really a serious issue. Another thing is cancer. We heard these studies. Or there's probably like one study. I'm not sure if there were studies. There was one study a number of years ago that said moderate consumption of red wine might help to offset risk of developing certain cancers. That has all but been kind of dismissed by the scientific community because there have been so many studies that actually show the reverse. And people, I think, took that to mean this is good for me. It was kind of a way to validate use, but there really is a lot of evidence that says that we can develop cancer if we're using alcohol pretty regularly. In fact, a New Zealand study found that there was strong evidence that there were correlations between alcohol use with all of these cancers, the 7 that are listed, plus some others potentially, such as pancreatic cancer, prostate, and skin cancer. The immune system can also be compromised by alcohol. And my goodness, we've been through an awful lot of talk about immunity in the last 3 years with COVID. So now more than ever, we really want to be careful about keeping our immune system really healthy. And alcohol does deplete the immune system. Other conditions, of course, mental health challenges, fibromyalgia, hearing loss, high blood pressure, STDs, just because, again, those inhibitions are down. Caution may not be there as it might be if we weren't under the influence of alcohol. But the good news is that when bad things happen to our organs, we can heal. So it takes some time, it takes some patience, but we can heal and get better after abstaining or at least cutting back dramatically. The benefits of quitting better looking skin, improved sleep, healthier weight, mental health improvements, immunity improvements, and so on, lowering some of those risks that we talked about. So lots of good reasons to get things either we're using less if we've been progressing in our use, or maybe even abstaining altogether. I don't know why that's blank. Oh, here, I know why. So what I wanted to say about this is I always like to say, since berries fell off bushes and fermented, there has been alcoholism, so there's been drinking, there's been celebration. Oh, it's so fun. It's so important for socializing. There's some old ads and we've got some newer ads, but everybody just looks so healthful and having a great time. And oh my goodness, it's such an integral part of so many sporting events and other kinds of entertainment and celebrations. It's just not only normalized, but really glorified in many ways. And it's kind of hard to avoid. And just imagine being a person who is in recovery from alcohol use disorder, walking to the grocery store these days, you get confronted with this, kind of right in your face with, it's just kind of everywhere. And again, how it helps to add to that validation that it's necessary and important to have it around. And I found a lot of these images on Etsy. I mean, this is stuff you see everywhere, right? It's just more celebration. I've heard somebody say that her aunt's house was decorated in alcohol. Basically, she had dish towels and signs up on the walls and all kind of things, like little decorations like this. So, very cute, very funny, right? But, it's just adding to that concept of all of this being so normalized. Yep. Here's the starter kit that's available on Etsy as well. So, or maybe I found this on Amazon, but if somebody turns 21, let's go ahead and launch them into drinking some alcohol. This one blew my mind. These are wine pairings for Girl Scout cookies. So maybe we're gone a little too far. This one, I think, right? So let's talk about why is it so important that we're addressing this one with a lens on that under 18-year-old person. And of course, the drinking age is 21. That's the legal age to consume alcohol in this country. But 18 is when we are the K through 12 population, and we have a lot of science about this. So this is if you've ever been on our programs, you've probably seen this slide so many times, but it's important. It's everything. If we start using any substance before we're 18, we have a 1 in 4 chance of developing a substance use disorder or an addiction. If we wait until we're over the age of 21, that risk has dropped to 1 in 25. So this is why we want to talk about these folks who are trying alcohol at a really young age. And as you're going to find out, there are a lot of, you can look at and see what is the influence, where does the influence come from to decide whether or not to drink alcohol. And this is a meta-analysis of a number of different studies that ask that question. And you can see that in all 5 studies, universally, it's the parents who are the most important influence. This doesn't mean that all of these parents influence how they drink. It means that they also might have influenced them to not drink. So this is really good for us to know as parents, because if you're equipped with this information, your kids are much less likely to have a substance use disorder, because knowledge is power, and you're getting a lot of great information when you learn about this. So one of the really important things, not only do we influence them with our words, but with our behaviors and our language that we use around alcohol. So I make no judgment about anybody who drinks alcohol who's over the age of 21 and is able to consume it in moderation and not drive and that sort of thing. But let's just be thoughtful about how we talk about it. So if I come in the door after work and my kids are there and I say, you saw that mommy juice, right? Like, I need to get myself a glass of wine before I even, think about making dinner. I've had a really rough day. Or when the friends come over for a party, the adult friends, and we say, the second they walk in the door, what can I get you to drink? What can I, so, kids like to emulate adults. They just do. We did, I'm sure we did. And so if we're modeling that this is really important for a social event, that it helps me to relax, then that's probably not the best message for our kids to hear or to see. And we know that there are certain times of the year, we're right here in April, but coming up is the summer. And then, of course, you have the holidays. And these are the times that are most likely for an under 18-year-old to try alcohol for the first time. So obviously, it's maybe a little bit more access, a little bit less structure, that sort of thing, just to be wary of. And the Pennsylvania Youth Survey is something that's conducted every other year. So it will be conducted this fall in 2023, but this is from the fall of 2021 data. And the best thing about the PAYS Pennsylvania Youth Survey is that we can look at trends. And this is past 30-day use of alcohol and cannabis or marijuana. And you can see that alcohol actually, and cannabis in this case, but alcohol is coming down. This is 2017, 2019, and 2021. So this is also borne out in national statistics. So alcohol use is actually decreasing for people who are under 18 years old. So this is really good news. And here's some more national data that shows the same thing. So we're seeing fewer and fewer kids initiate use. This is past 30-day use, even daily or lifetime or anything between. It all seems to be dropping, not super precipitously, but it is decreasing. When you look at the kids who have identified that they've been using alcohol, they were asked, if you're using it, where did you get it? This is what's a little bit concerning. So somebody gave somebody money to buy it for me. That's coming down. This is 2017, 2019, 21. So you can see that is coming down, but look what's going up is provided to me by my parents or a friend's parents provided to me. Those numbers are kind of creeping up, especially parents providing it to me. This does not mean that 50% of sixth graders are getting alcohol from their parents. This means of the sixth graders who have had alcohol, half of them got it from their parents. So does that mean they had a sip? We don't know. We have no idea. But I just want to share that with you. But what's really important for us to talk about, because when we consider this a prevention program. So if somebody is not drinking alcohol, before they're 18, that is great news. But even if they're kind of putting the toe in the water, what happens when those transition periods? So when a young person leaves home or goes off to college or starts a new job and there's just a big life change or relocates in some way. These are times that put our kids at risk. And this could even be like middle school to high school, moves, things like that. But I want us to kind of think about that emerging adult, the 18-year-old, roughly 18-year-old who might be leaving home, might be starting college, things like that. So here you can see, and this is a national survey that was done, this is just showing through 2017. But you can see that here the 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, again, this is national, really coming down in their alcohol use. This is lifetime alcohol use. It has not come down nearly as much as we would like for those 19 to 28-year-olds. So this isn't necessarily even college age, just young adults, right? But look at the gap, look at the difference and how much that has picked up after those high school years, those formative years. So here's a more recent survey that was done, or research that was done. This is from 2021, looking at 19 to 30-year-olds. So in 2021, in the past year, 82% roughly of them drank alcohol at all, had any alcohol at all in the past year. If you look at the past month, it was about 66%. But what was really kind of stark was this 13% had 10 or more drinks in a row in the past 2 weeks. And that's the highest recorded number they've had since they started conducting this survey in 2005. So if we are parents of teens, what can we do? We can have really clear boundaries. We can say, it's not okay. I'm not okay with you drinking. I just had this conversation with a parent who felt that she needed to prepare her child for college and give her a lot of tips about drinking. I completely understand the desire to do that, but we just want to make sure that we are not saying, I'm okay with this, because I'm really not okay. There's science behind the legal age being 21. In fact, there are a lot of people who would love to advocate for this happening, but it won't, for their drinking age to be raised to 25. because that's when that prefrontal cortex is fully developed. We're much less risk, as you saw earlier, the older we are. Certainly, if we didn't have any kind of mood altering psychoactive substance until we're at least 25, our risks of having a problem with it would be greatly diminished. So we can be very clear about the fact that this is not okay with us. But we can be at home when they have a party, when they have friends over. We are the parent, not the friend. So we get to say, sorry, we've got to check backpacks. I'm going to make sure that the window well to the game room is locked. That's something that I learned the hard way. Is a really easy way for people to get booze into the house is to go through the little window well if they have a game room or someplace downstairs. But when talking about our own family history, genetics plays a huge part in our potential risk factors for developing a substance use disorder. So if we have alcoholism or other substance use disorders in the family, we want to be clear about that. If we have diabetes or heart conditions, we want to say, look, we're at risk. We have to watch our diet and exercise, things like that. Same goes for substance use disorders. We need to be really clear about that without using shaming language, though. We don't want to be negative about somebody that we love, or somebody that was like, or maybe it's not even somebody who's around anymore, whether it was grandpa or an aunt or someone like that. We don't want to be disparaging about it, because if we show that we have a bias toward people who have problems with substances, our kids aren't going to be very likely to be honest with us about their own use, about their concerns about a sibling or a friend or another family member. So we really want to be thoughtful about that language. Alcohol-free opportunities to have fun. Yeah, you don't have to, we can show in our actions and with suggested activities and stuff that we don't have to have alcohol to have a good time. There are lots of ways to have fun without it. And being respectful of their thoughts about it. So if we hear them say something that we don't agree with, we don't have to jump down their throat and start shutting down their thinking we're going to change their thought process. We can respectfully listen and then share our thoughts and get curious and ask them some more questions. More on that in a little bit. And then if you hear something that's just incorrect, you can say, that's just not true. So when a child might say, well, everybody drinks, that's actually not true. It's only about a third of kids that really have had alcohol in the past. I think it's 30 days is about 30%, or maybe it's past year. I think it's past year is about 30%. So, that's a social norm. That's wanting to believe this is true, but it could also be that sorry, my allergies are terrible. So my voice is coming in and out. They've surrounded themselves with people who like to try substances. So they have this mindset that everybody's doing it, but not necessarily so. So some ways that we can have difficult conversations is to know that maybe we're not even ready to have a conversation. My son's drug of choice in the early years was not really alcohol, it was cannabis, but doesn't really matter. The same rule applies. I wasn't ready to have a conversation when I discovered that he was high, because I sat him down when he was high. His dad and I sat him down and had a conversation that was fruitless. It had absolutely no impact, no positive impact. In fact, it probably made him want to run away from us and go get high again, because that was not the right time. I wasn't ready. I was upset. I was afraid. I wanted to shut it down as quickly as I could, and I couldn't. I didn't have that kind of control or that power. So I was not ready for that conversation. So we also want to be ready to really listen. So being prepared to ask a question and get curious and say, like, this is the third time that I'm aware of that you've been drinking. So can you please talk to me about why you're continuing to do this, knowing that we're not okay with it? Talk to me and be really open. And so that when they're talking with us, now we need to be cautious of our facial expression, our anxiety that we have. Am I doing this kind of thing? And like, oh my God, I'm folding my arms and looking distressed and unhappy and angry. We might be feeling those things, but that will shut down a conversation. We don't want to drive our kids further underground with this. We want to keep it open. We want to have conversations. And it's really important to be consistent. Hopefully being on the same page with the other parent, even if it's behind the scenes, so that we may not always agree on everything that we're discussing with our kids, but we don't want to have those disagreements in front of them. If we can get on the same page, independently of them, then present a united front, that's really, really helpful. So we've had so many conversations about alcohol in the 12 years that we've been doing this. And so I just wanted to bring up a few and share some things that I've learned about them. So one thing that I hear parents say is we have an agreement with our kids that if they drink, they can call us for a ride with no questions asked. Some challenges with this are, why would we not have a conversation when they've decided to drink underage? They made that decision, but we're not going to ask any questions about that. And I chatted with my son about this at one point, and he said, if I made the decision to drink and then was drunk, why would that be the moment that I decided I was going to be honest with you? That's absolutely not going to, he felt it was not going to happen. There was no way he was going to call me and say, I've had too much to drink, come and get me. So just not likely to have that happen. And they don't want us to see them drunk or using, right? So another one is, I hear this a lot. Well, in Europe, in other countries, the drinking age is lower and they have less alcoholism. Absolutely not true. Actually, European countries have much higher rates of alcohol than we do, particularly places like Russia, and there's some others, but truly that forbidden fruit theory is not holding up water, because it's just not the case. I mean, as I said, there's a lot of science behind the reason the drinking age is 21. And so we really want to reinforce that and say that this goes for us too. And it's not any better in Europe than it is here, I promise. And here's that forbidden fruit mentality, right? And there's this study that was done by University of Minnesota looking at permissiveness. And it turns out that there are actually some other studies that back this up as well, that permissiveness is not a protective factor. In fact, it puts kids more at risk. Basically, their message that they're getting is, you're okay with me drinking. Because really, what child wants their only time that they're going to be drinking to be with mom and dad? Basically, the message is that we're okay with this. As I said, this is not our opportunity to make a friend. This is our child. We're their parent. They have lots of opportunities to friends. Kids have one or two chances at a parent. And so sometimes we have to have those hard conversations. And I would much rather have them when they're young and build a friendship later when they're adults. But when they are young, we can have really good conversations by connecting with them. This was something that Jill, you're going to hear from in a moment, inspired me to add to the slide deck, because connection is so very important. It's also a good time, even if there's something going on with our child that we're worried about, we're really concerned about them, and they've gotten in trouble or whatever. Let's not have all of our conversations be about that. Let's not have everything be heavy. Let's just find opportunities to be light and do fun things together and keep that relationship strong and healthy, so that when it's time to talk about the hard things, we've really had a nice connection with them that's been fostered over the years. And just finding time to be a family and put down the technology. This is true prevention, right? It's just family time together without technology distracting us, and beginning curious about everybody's day. And helping our kids to talk about some of the decisions that they make that we may not love. This is being a kid, is making mistakes, right? We've all been there, we've all done it, but we want them to realize that we're not going to be ashamed. We're not going to be, deeply disappointed in them. We love them, and we just want them to be honest. We might want to have them see someone to talk to professionally, like a therapist, because we can't homeschool all of this, especially if it starts getting uncomfortable for us and we're feeling out of our league. This is beyond my scope. Even if I were a therapist, it's my child, and I really shouldn't be the one kind of working through some of these really serious challenges they might be having. So encouraging them to seek professional help, through our support for doing that, is a really helpful thing. And even though we know none of our brains are fully developed until we're at least 25 years old, that's not necessarily language that we want to use with kids. So we can say, you are so lucky Your brain is still malleable. It's still building great connections. So this is not the time to add one of those substances. This is not the time to introduce alcohol into our brain and our body, not the time to introduce cannabis or any other substances. This is the time to learn how to cope with stress, to learn how to be mindful and meditate even. These are skills that can be built, just like learning languages, learning musical instruments, learning a sport, all the ways that our brain is wired to learn. It puts us at great risk when the things that we're feeding it are not good for us. And so I love that expression, what fires together wires together. So we really want, again, to build those really helpful connections. That's all I have for now. I'm sure I'll want to chime in more later as your questions come in and things. But now I get to introduce you to Jill first and then Heather. So Jill, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if you can tell folks a little bit more about what you do, I'd appreciate it.
Yes. Hello. My name is Jill Adams, as Kim mentioned earlier. So I actually have the pleasure of sitting on the board for Be a Part of the Conversation. And I think it's been about 5-ish years at this point. I kind of lose track after a period of time. But I also am an executive director for a company called Onward Behavioral Health. We specialize in mental health, substance use, and eating disorder treatment for adolescents and adults. So my background is more so in the area of juvenile justice as well as adolescent substance use treatment. So I will say, I think part of the ask for me was to kind of talk about what we see in our programs. And we do have a program specifically for adolescents with primary mental health diagnosis and secondary drug and alcohol. We call that co-occurring. So it is a PHP, partial hospital level of care. So we do see pretty intensive presentations with our clients. And, talking to Kim about what we're seeing with alcohol use, I do think it's important to recognize the type of work that we do, and the focus is that, again, it is primarily mental health, and significant depression is typically what we're seeing. However, when we're treating substance use along with mental health disorders, what we're currently seeing is that a lot of our adolescents are starting to drink around age 13. So to kind of go back to what Kim was talking about, and, that age of onset, and then what that could really mean for the future, that is pretty concerning. And again, if a 13-year-old starts drinking and then comes into a program like ours, at the age of maybe 15 or 16, and we're treating significant mental health disorder as well as significant substance use disorders, imagine where things could go. And I think that's really, when we're talking about young adults and, the drinking patterns that we're seeing, it's sort of like setting the stage for potentially pretty scary stuff. So I think that's the biggest thing for me to highlight in terms of what we're seeing. We equally see THC use along with alcohol use, but I do think the trends have certainly changed throughout the number of past years. Also, as you can see with the statistics that Kim was sharing. So I think the points that I have are really, a lot of it is about the modeling. And we talk a lot about this in a lot of our presentations around substance use in general and parenting. So what I can say for sure is, I'm sure, we're familiar with Truly's, White Claws, the High Noons, and all that kind of stuff. I mean, really, in the past, I think 2-3 years, the goal has kind of been, how do we make this alcohol taste better? So, a lot of what we see is that our teenagers are getting into their parents' supply of this alcohol that tastes better. So, I think historically we might see a lot of our kids getting into the liquor cabinet. And, that can kind of be a little bit gross depending on, what your taste buds are telling you. So now, if your first taste of alcohol is something that tastes fruity and tastes good, imagine then what that can, again, be setting the stage for. Not to mention that, I think a I certainly see with my generation, we have a pool party, we're all drinking, we have our seltzers, we have our beers, even to parents drinking on the sidelines at a soccer game. And, that is not really something that our kids miss. I think they see these things and they know what's going on. And again, it sends a message, it's modeling, as well as the, hey, I'm stressed, I'm going to go have a drink, or I'm going to go out with my friends. Our kids are watching and they're seeing all of this unfold in front of them. I have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, and my own kids definitely pick up on everything that they see. And, if anybody in this home is having a drink, I'm very big on this child is not going to get it from the fridge. So even something as small as that, to start modeling that, your children are not your beer fetchers, I guess is kind of the point behind that. So I'm trying to just look at my notes here too. I think the other thing too that we see is parents, sometimes we lose track of the fact that we really should be mindful about locking up our alcohol. If we're going to have it in the home, let's not make it readily accessible for kids. And obviously you can see the stats, parents being really the top supplier of alcohol. And I don't think it's always knowingly. So not to, say our parents are doing all these bad things. It's not, I think a lot of parents have very good intentions. We're busy. We have social lives. We have our professional lives. We're taking care of our kids, and it can be something that's just not the focus. And it should be the focus, because you want to make sure that, you're not just giving your family access to something that could be really dangerous to them. Just like we talk about locking up your medication, same concept. Let me see. I think another trend, again, it kind of comes down to what we were talking about in terms of, I saw that stat for those 6th graders, and, parents might just be giving their first sip of alcohol. Hey, you want to try this? Or, your child is asking because they're curious. Hey, what does that taste like? And it seems like it's not a big deal. But again, think about if that first sip is something that tastes good and makes you feel good. And then what does that mean? What message is that sending? So that's something else that we're seeing too, is that first sip is typically being provided by a parent or an adult that is close, is a family friend or another family member. The other thing that I was also, let me see, I think we're also looking at not only taking alcohol from a parent's supply, but then stealing it from stores. So a lot of the alcohol that we have in grocery stores now, it can be very accessible to kids. It's now in Wawas as well. So, we are kind of opening up this ability for I guess, increased theft of alcohol from stores. I would like to believe that this would be caught, but I also understand that theft is something that is not always caught. Obviously, that's part of the issue. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, how it's also just gotten more accessible from that perspective as well. So we are also seeing teens stealing alcohol from grocery stores and places like Wawa. I think the last thing that, in terms of something to kind of look at, I was talking to Kim about just there's been such an increase in eating disorders amongst adolescents and adults. And one trend that has been around for a while, I think it's just worth noting, is it's something called drunkorexia. So this is essentially where they may restrict what they're eating or not eat prior to drinking alcohol. And then, basically trying to either quickly have the effect of alcohol or using the alcohol as basically like, these are my calories for the day. And then if you take it even further, some people are then purging that, which is where kind of the bulimia side of things comes in, purging it by vomiting or purging it by using laxatives. So Again, this is something that it's not necessarily, I think, super, super common right now, but it's definitely worth talking about, especially with our college-aged kids. If you think about body image and the pressure that tends to be put on our kids, especially going into that young adult age, this is something that certainly does happen. You might be familiar with someone saying at some point, "Oh, I'm drinking my calories today." So it's kind of the same concept, but it's being put into a term essentially. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing and some of the points that I wanted to hit. I would absolutely say just the concept of spending time with your kids and knowing what they're doing, allowing them to talk to you about their questions, curiosity. Even if it's something as silly as sitting and playing some video games with your child, just see what they're doing and partake in what they like to do. It's really helpful to keep those lines of communication open. And if a child is feeling like, okay, my parent doesn't like what I do, doesn't really like what I like to do, so I'm not going to be as open with them. I feel judged. I kind of feel like they're not really interested in learning about me as a person. Those are messages that are kind of sent, which then really can put a wall up between you and your child when stuff like this is something that needs to be talked about. So I think that's also just important to note. Kim, is there anything else that you would want me to review?
I think you covered a lot. Thank you, Jill. That's helpful. There are a couple of advanced questions that we got that we'll get to in a little bit, but I think let's have Heather jump in with her sharing her story. But I really want to encourage everybody to think of any questions you might have for any of us in just a bit. Heather, thank you. And again, I would just want to say how important it is that we hear from somebody who's in recovery, your transparency. You've been with us so many times, and I'm always grateful. You're a dear friend, and really glad that you're with us tonight. So, floor is yours.
Thanks, Kim. I'm happy to be here. So my name is Heather, and I am an alcoholic and a drug addict in recovery. And I was definitely one of the numbers that Kim was talking about in her presentation. I grew up in like a very normal family, but normal per se, like nice family, on the main line. I went to good schools. And I was around my parents drinking a lot. Neither of my parents are alcoholics. However, my grandmother is an alcoholic and she died from her alcoholism. And my uncle also died from his addictions. And my brother is also a person in recovery now too. So Kim mentioned it, this is genetic, and we were never really talked to about like the genetic factor in our family. But I have a memory from childhood, and I must have been 8, maybe even younger. And my brother and I were like bothering my dad to try his beer because he was always drinking a Budweiser, and like we weren't allowed to have it because like it was like, it was this sacred thing. Like, why can't we try it? And he let us both try it because he assumed we would hate it. I was like, ew, my brother wanted more. And that's when they realized there was a problem. But that's exactly like those numbers. Like I was like probably 7 or 8 years old, like trying an alcoholic beverage. And that's, yeah, I mean, it's not sending the best message. So I should move forward to my middle school years. I had trouble in school, in middle school, in the public school system. I have a learning disability, and was really struggling to get through school. And in the 6th grade, so probably like 11 or 12, I was put on medication, like stimulant medication, which, yeah, as you may or may not know, but that was like, it doesn't help your prefrontal cortex develop. And that's kind of like one of like my first experience with an addictive or mind altering substance. as I got through middle school, I started to wonder about drinking alcohol and smoking pot. And in the 8th grade, me and all my girlfriends raided, just like what you were talking about. We raided our her parents' liquor cabinet, and everyone got these Gatorade bottles and completely emptied them, and then just filled like a little bit of everything in each bottle. Because we didn't know what we're doing, but we knew we wanted to get drunk. Like we planned this for weeks. And like her older brother was there and with his friends, and like I took a sip of the bottle and so did all my friends, and everyone was like, ew, this is gross, because you can only imagine like all of these liquors mixed together. But I kept drinking it. I drank my whole bottle, and then I drank my friends' bottles. And as an 8th grader, like 13, 14 years old, like I was absolutely hammered. And I ended up with alcohol poisoning that night. And I threw up all night long, and I threw up all morning long. And I ended up convincing my dad that I actually had like a stomach bug, and he ended up like, and he believed me, even though like I was throwing up all over his car on the way home. I don't know. I was an 8th grade student with alcohol poisoning, and no one did anything about it. And I didn't want to drink as much after that. And then I started smoking weed a lot. And I smoked weed every single day from the age of like 14 up until probably 25. And then like, it just kind of turned into like, after like in high school, kind of turned into like a party girl, and I was going out on the weekends and I was drinking with my friends, and I was constantly drinking and driving, and I didn't see anything wrong with it because I thought everyone was doing it too. But I was just hanging out around people who also liked to do what I was doing. When I was 16, I was out looking for fun. And by fun, to me, what that meant was alcohol and parties. And I ended up drinking with the wrong people. And I was sexually assaulted after being roofied by a stranger who was in their 40s, and I was 16. And like, those are some of like the very real consequences of like drinking underage for me. And no one still stepped in at that point. And I just continued on with like my life and my lifestyle of drinking and smoking weed. And oh gosh, I mean, later down the line, one of the things you said, Kim, about the huge life changes, when I changed from high school to college, having very little like support in, I don't know, like the emotional support, I didn't know what to do. And all I did, I went to like 3 classes my first semester of college, and I just went to parties every single night. I started drinking on the weekdays, smoking weed multiple times a day, every day. And then I ended up finding opiates. I initially broke my foot and was prescribed Percocet at Temple Hospital, and that was my biggest. That was it for me. Like I said, screw college. I'm dropping out of college, and I started taking Percocet every single day while still living like my party girl lifestyle. And oh gosh, after like a few weeks, actually, I realized that I was addicted to opiates. I had no idea what that was. I knew nothing about addiction, even though it was so like rampant in my family. I did not know that like I could be physically addicted to something like this. And I remember my first like opiate withdrawal, and like I couldn't sit still, and I felt sick, and it was just like time was moving at a snail's pace, and like I couldn't comprehend that like I'm a drug addict. Like I realized I'm a drug addict, and I needed to get more drugs so I could feel better. And, a year later, I'm spending $600 a day on this Percocet habit. The girl that was in college has now dropped out and she's living in an abandoned house. And she's stealing from her family and eventually like runs out of money. And I start selling myself for drugs and for it's really unbelievable when I even say it back, because like, this really is like where my life led. Like all of these little things came up to, like, I'm now homeless. I'm selling myself. I have lost my teeth. I've lost my hair. I'm 90 pounds. And I'm now shooting heroin. Like I am now officially a drug addict. I'm a junkie. And while this lasted for like 7 years. So when I was 27, found out that I was pregnant after being addicted to heroin and homeless. And I got pregnant because I wanted to smoke weed with some guy. And so I asked this guy to smoke weed with me, and we had sex and I got pregnant. And luckily, that is when I asked for help from my family. And it took some time. I remember after giving birth, still drinking a little bit, and because like just to get through the day. But I have been clean and sober since my daughter turned 1. And it's almost coming up on 5 years now. But I mean, my life is amazing today, and I've rebuilt everything. But like, I think it's really important for everyone to hear the reality of, where these little things can take you. Kim, do you want me to touch on anything else?
Thank you, Heather. I mean, I would like to know what you have a daughter. So how would you address things if you started to see her curiosity toward alcohol or other substances? I mean, I'm sure you've given this some thought, right?
I've given this a lot of thought. Well, as I told you earlier, I have, I'm already like addressing early intervention things, trying to give her the coping skills and the things and the emotional support that she needs and will need. And I think we don't have alcohol in the house because I don't drink. And my fiance doesn't need to drink in that way. We don't keep alcohol in the house. But I plan on, being totally open and honest with her about it. I would love to have these conversations. We've already kind of gone over what alcohol is and drugs, because she hears about it, like, on TV or wherever, like she'll hear like, what's drugs? Like what's alcohol? Like, why can't you drink and drive? And so like, I've already started planting the seed. It's like, these are things that people do, but sometimes they're bad and they make you feel different. And they're not for everybody. And mommy doesn't drink.
Thanks. I love that. So yeah, we have a couple of questions that have come in. There were some earlier, some of you submitted some questions in advance, and I really appreciate that so much. I think some of them we covered. I'll tell you what they are. So one was, do you have any, this one I don't have an answer for. Do you have any data on teens that don't drink in high school, but start in college? We don't have, there's something called the ABCD study that is being conducted by the National Institute on Drug Abuse that's going to follow kids for a number of years. But that we're still in the early stages of that. And so we don't have those kinds of outcomes yet. And the research that I shared earlier in my presentation shows certainly, like even looking at the Pennsylvania Youth Survey and even national studies, they just show us trends. They really don't show us the specific age of onset. I can tell you with what I knew a guy isn't research, right? But I can tell you that my son, the first time he used anything, he was 13 years old. Everyone that all the clinicians like Jill and others who I've worked with over the years have made it pretty clear that that's not unusual. But Jill, would you like to chime in on that? Like what you see as kind of that introductory age? whether it's alcohol or other substances?
Yeah, I mean, so again, like we were talking about yesterday, I think it's important for me to be able to keep things into perspective in terms of what I'm seeing because of the type of work that we do. We have pretty intensive higher level of care programs. So we are not typically working with like the average kid. So that's what I just want to put out there. I think the trend that I've seen from my experience working in juvenile justice versus directly treating adolescents with substance use disorder, and now what we're seeing with our co-occurring programming and our clients within those programs, the trend, I think, for first use of alcohol does really tend to be 12 to 13 years old. I have also seen marijuana use starting at like age 10. So I don't think that's more of the average, but again, with the type of programs that I've been working in and been overseeing, we are talking about people that have a higher likelihood of having like an actual addiction down the road, if not currently already having one. So yes, I would agree. 12, 13 is kind of the standard that I've seen. And then marijuana use, THC use can also happen typically a little bit younger than that. So I think the other thing too, I don't know if it's helpful to talk about just the changes in different stages of like childhood versus adolescence versus young adulthood. That might also hit on another question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so without going into too much detail, I think, we're always looking at like generational changes and what happens when, we have a new wave or a new generation of parents. It's a new parenting style. But we then also see how things change with our kids. So what we've been seeing in the past, I would say past few years, maybe like 2 years at this point, is childhood has been kind of extended. So your 14-year-old today looks different than your 14-year-old probably did like 6 years ago, just in terms of maturity and experience and things that they're exposed to. So we're seeing that, you're a little bit less mature going into your later ages where you'd kind of think adolescence is starting. So then adolescence picks up and is only lasting for maybe 2 to 3 years, if that. And then we're throwing you into adulthood. So if you think about like your adolescent years are really those years that we're training you to be a young adult. And if we've made that so much shorter because of the way that we are parenting and raising our kids, then when they go to college, then the likelihood of that experience being a huge shock to the system is pretty high. So I think that's just worth talking about. And I think it also goes into the conversations that we're having with our kids about what to expect when they're in school. So we're not saying, hey, don't drink this way, drink this way. We're talking about, hey, this can happen. If you do find yourself in a situation, be mindful that these are things that can happen. Heather's story is a big example of what can happen if you are intoxicated and somebody takes advantage of you. And these are real things that we have to talk to kids about so that they're prepared to go into that next stage of their lives. So, I don't know how necessarily we change that trend, but it is definitely something that we see. And I think I have a program, we start treating the kids at 12, mental health focus, but we're treating at 12. And then, then we have another program that starts treating, it's like age 14, 15. We kind of split them up like it's middle school versus high school. And our middle school kids, the maturity levels, so my point being the maturity levels are so much different between just those few years. There's a huge, huge difference. And so it's just something I think worth talking about. It plays into a lot of the things that we talk about with Be a Part of the Conversation.
Great. Heather, do you have any thoughts about this question about the age of onset? I mean, you have plenty of people in your world who are in recovery. You're muted.
the majority of stories that I hear do come from that like 13, 14 range. However, I heard a story the other day of someone that did not drink in high school and only started in college. But so, I mean, that's a thing too.
Yeah, it is a thing. It sure is. Alcohol's tricky, especially. I think alcohol is different than a lot of substances in that the addiction isn't necessarily as rapid as it might be with some other substances that are more. I mean, nicotine is more addictive than alcohol. Certainly, opioids can be much more addictive, but alcohol is. I mean, there's a reason in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous it says cunning, baffling, and powerful. The cunning part of it, I think, is that the progression can be pretty slow. I mean, if it's totally normalized, if it's very ubiquitous, it feels like it's everywhere, it's in your kind of your lifestyle, but you start off moderately, right? You start off just having it here and there. But if you life challenges come along, you could be 50 years old and have lost your job, or your relationship falls apart, or some tragedy happens, you have some trauma or something like that. What happens at a lot of funerals is a lot of drinking. So that shows us, right? Or they'll give a widow a prescription for benzodiazepines, some Valium or Xanax to numb and calm yourself. And, so what happens is that becomes a very slow progression toward maladaptive use or no longer moderation, and what that cunning piece is that I'm feeling like it's helping me. I'm convinced that it's helping me. That disease of addiction is telling me this, oh no, this is normal, then you need this, it's okay. So we go and go and go until, my dad is an alcoholic in recovery. He got sober at 66. He's 91 now, so he was not drinking alcoholically, for 40 years. It didn't start until things in his life were getting challenging. And so it's not always that first use is huge, that developing brain, really, really, really important. But I think alcohol is tricky because it is so ubiquitous. It is so commonly used that you can easily slide away from that on that spectrum of use, and we have on our follow-up page, the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual that has the criteria for alcoholism. And it's a really simple checklist of like, do I meet some of this criteria for alcohol use disorder? So I just think it is very, very tricky. So here's a really good question. Is the problem that they start drinking earlier, or that us as a parent don't teach them how to drink safely? Also teaching them the risk of drinking irresponsibly, drinking and driving, mixing drinks and other drugs, or using drinking as an escape for other underlying problems. Joe, do you want to talk about how to have some of those kinds of conversations with our kids? And at what ages do we have those conversations, do you think?
So I did write this note down earlier and then I didn't even speak about it. So I think having the conversations early is important. So you can start having conversations young about this stuff, and you just tailor it to what your child can understand based on their developmental stages. And, one of the things I think that talking to parents, and even with these programs that we do, one of the things that I think is huge is, when our kids are seeing somebody that's intoxicated, talk about it. Hey, did you see anything going on with Uncle John or whatever at the party? Because most likely they're thinking it and don't feel comfortable saying it. So it could be something that, as a parent, you bring up and just say, do you have any questions about what was going on? Or, how do you feel about what you saw? In the event that somebody is overly intoxicated around the kids, like they're going to see it at some point. So talk about it. I think the curiosity that they have may not always come out. And I think it's helpful to start those conversations young. In terms of teaching how to drink responsibly, I think that can be tricky too, because, we want to we want to have the conversations and talk about what is responsible, but can we do that in a way that we're not encouraging our kids to be drinking when they shouldn't be, or drinking before they're prepared? But I absolutely think talking about the dangers of drinking and driving is really, really important. And the risk factors of what could happen if you're drinking or using substances at any point in time. What does that actually look like? And what can this do to your life if you find yourself going down that path? Those conversations and being open, I think is really, really important. I think, again, as long as it's a balance of I'm informing you and trying to help you make good decisions versus, I'm sure I'm not sending the message that, hey, I'm talking to you about this because I think you're allowed to start drinking, or you're allowed to start doing this. So that can be a fine line for some people. And I also think self-disclosure is something that kind of can easily come up as a parent. One teen that I worked with kind of sticks out in my mind, where, there was a conversation that happened between he and his dad. And this conversation really was about hey, Dad, what did you do when you were my age? And Dad was very honest with him. And he took that as permission, and specifically would talk about how, hey, my dad told me about his past. And I know that because of that, I'm probably in better shape and I'm good. So he took it as permission to drink, smoke weed, all that kind of stuff. And I don't think the father was really prepared for that to be something that we were having to talk about. So that's my long-winded answer of saying, talk about it early, and just have a balance of informative, but not permissive. If that makes sense.
Wow, that's really interesting, Jill, because everything that I've read about this question of what to do when your child asks you about your own use is to be honest. But you're saying there's a little bit of a cautionary tale there. Is that right? I mean, so we have this handout, actually. This when we were in person a lot more pre-COVID, this was one of our most popular handouts that got picked up. It was how to talk to your kids about drugs if you use drugs. And basically what this is, the guidance is that you should be honest. You do not need to get into the weeds of your story. You do not need, and then this one time, and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
But to also add, if I knew then what I know now, I'm going to impart this wisdom on you that I understand now. That's really important to point that out. And I've had a parent say that to me, well, what could I say? Yeah, I did used to get high. So what could I say? Well, you're the parent. You get to say, didn't go well, wasn't a good idea. Or even if it you didn't have a problem, you have knowledge that you gain. People on this program have knowledge now that they may not have before about the risks. And so we can add those important lessons learned in there too, right?
Yes. And I think the message with that is, if you're self-disclosing, are you getting into the weeds? Is this, are you kind of making it sound like it was fun at some point? And then what is the follow-up past that piece of the conversation? I think that's probably the biggest difference. So, yes, kids are going to be curious about what we've done. I think I've already had my son ask me questions about things that I've done, and I will be honest, and then also make sure that I'm not giving details that are going to make anything seem as though he's taking it as hey, that sounded like it was a good time, or I'm taking this as permission to do X, Y, Z. And I mean, having worked with so many teens where this is a conversation, the self-disclosure piece it can be tricky depending on what the goal of the conversation really is. Right.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, great. And there's a really good question for Heather too, but I want to circle back. I'm obsessed with this book. Have you ever read this book, Jill?
I don't think I'm reading much these days, honestly.
Okay. It's on Audible too. So this is by Judith Grisel. I saw her do a TED talk and I immediately got the book. It's really quick read. You can see how skinny it is. But I'm going to read this little part of it. This is on the chapter about alcohol. She's amazing. She's in recovery and then she went to get her PhD in neuroscience and she's just brilliant. So she's constantly referencing her own personal story and it's fascinating. But in the chapter on alcoholism, which I was rereading today, the pattern of drinking among college students is more prevalent among college students. Nearly 40% of college students reported binge drinking in the past month. And about half of those students met the criteria for an alcohol use disorder, and 25% had academic consequences from drinking. The impact of high alcohol concentrations during this plastic period, meaning when the brain is still developing, leads to lasting alterations in brain structure and function and is more likely to result in an alcohol use disorder. One last thing, people who begin drinking in their early 20s, as I did, are at least 4 times more likely to eventually meet the criteria for an alcohol use disorder. In fact, the lifetime risk for substance abuse and dependence decreases about 5% with each additional year between ages 13 and 21. That's pretty impressive and pretty compelling argument for like, just no substances, please, no substances until their brain is fully developed at least. Heather, what resources did you utilize to become clean and sober, if you're willing to share that?
Of course. So I went to rehab. I went to both Miramont and Karen. And then after rehab, and actually I should say after Miramont, like with the first time I went to the Light program. And then after Karen, I went to rehab after work. No, and then the Light program. I did both of the ones. I did them both. And then I go to AA. I identify with AA. And I still actively go at least once or twice a week.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very gracious of you. Can you talk about, like, kind of back up a little bit and talk about how you got there, though? You went there, but how did you get there? Were you interested in that, or was that something that was?
How I got to rehab, it was when I was pregnant after I had my daughter. And I was still not doing well. I was in an emotionally and physically abusive relationship. And I was finding myself putting like Kahlua in my coffee in the morning because it was really hard to be home with a baby by myself and still like sitting in all of like my sickness, my disease of addiction. And I started smoking weed again and things just progressed. And this is maybe more personal than it needs to be, but when my daughter's father left, and just kind of left, I spiraled really quickly down, and my family intervened, and I finally surrendered, and I said, let's do this.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's rare. I don't want to say rarely. I don't even know what the stats are on this, but for somebody who's in active addiction, it takes a Herculean effort to say, I need help. Like, it's time. You obviously had a real compelling reason to want to, you had a child, you had your daughter, so that does not always guarantee, though. I mean, we know so many folks, right, who I'll never forget Stephen O'Neill, who's a drug court judge in Montgomery County. He's amazing, and he really understands this disease. And he says, no one deserves our compassion more than the addicted mom, like what that mom is going through with shame, with the stress of being a new parent and having this disease that has consumed them probably for some years. It's truly can be such a huge challenge. So I'm so glad that things have gone so beautifully in your life. But to think that someone is going to just on their own, without the intervention of loved ones, decide that they need help before hitting some really horrific bottom. it's pretty tough. I don't know, Jill, do you have any thoughts about like when to step in? And I think this is true with alcoholism too, with alcohol use. It's like, where's the line? It's hard enough to see it in ourselves, but even for the loved ones, for the family members, for the spouse, the partner, the kids, I said my dad's an alcoholic. I tried to intervene when I was in my 20s and get him to go to treatment. He wasn't having it, and I didn't know what I was doing. But it's, I didn't know the right words to use then. And I just wonder, when we worry about somebody who's drinking alcoholically, how do we know when to step in?
It's interesting that we're talking about this right now, because I actually, without going into too much depth, I had a family member with a friend who I think when I was a teenager, I thought there was an issue with alcohol and didn't really know how to address it. Figured all the adults were aware and were having the conversations. And it just took until probably last summer for me to have the guts to say something, because I was like, this is kind of obvious right now. And knowing what I know now, I was scared for this person. And so what I realized and what I learned at that point is no one really was doing much. And the situation was very, very bad, very, very dangerous. So, I think it can be hard, to your point, Kim, like, how do you get through to this person? And I really think that, as soon as you start seeing those concerns or you're starting to get worried, have the conversation and have it as often as you need to try and get some of that messaging across. And it's coming from a place of love, not coming from judgment, not coming from disappointment, but a place of love. And, certainly can be a long, grueling process. But I think not having the conversation and not speaking up is in some ways contributing to things kind of being what they are, getting worse. I too have he's passed away a long time ago, but my grandfather was also an alcoholic. And what I learned also at a very young age is the conversations weren't happening. And it was just normal for my grandpa to pull out a bottle of Old Crow before he got into his truck. You might have heard me hear this, or might have heard me tell the story before, but I mean, my grandpa would take swigs of his Old Crow before he would get in the truck. He had a bottle of whiskey in his truck and he would drive us around. He drank beer pretty much all day. He was a very nice, fun person, but this was what was happening. And when I got old enough to recognize what was going on, I'm looking around at like all the adults. I'm like, is anyone gonna say something about this? And it was blowing my mind. So I eventually, at probably the age of 15, said, like, I'm not getting in the car with you. And it was, I think, a shock for everybody. I'm like, I'm not doing that. This is scaring me because I know what could happen. So again, seeing the differences between intervening when you start having concerns versus like kind of being afraid or not knowing, you're probably never going to know if you don't at least try and stay persistent. So that's my thought, and also having my own personal experiences with that too. That's tough though.
Yep. Thanks, Jill. There's one of our participants has shared a story about helping their sister to drink heavily, encouraging their sister to drink heavily so that she would experience a hangover, which they believe helped her to not continue to drink a lot. And I just want to share that can be effective for some people, perhaps, but I've heard, just as Heather is with us tonight, we've had many people like Heather share their story, and I'll never forget one of them who said the first time he drank heavily was when he was very young. He threw up, he felt sick, and he couldn't wait to do it again. So it's not always effective. It's not always going to be a deterrent. Thankfully, it sounds like it was helpful in this case, but if this is kind of like any introduction of a mood altering or psychoactive substance is a little bit like playing Russian roulette, especially if we don't know a lot about our family history or we don't know the impact of mental health challenges and things. So for some people, they hate the taste, they hate the smell, all this kind of stuff. Heather described how her friends hated the taste of what they concocted with all the juices and alcohol and stuff, but she loved it. But I think she loved the feeling, not necessarily the Gatorade and all that.
I didn't like the taste. Nothing was going to stop me from continuing to feel that way.
Right. So for somebody who, is at risk for this, or even if they don't like how it tastes today, down the road, it can fill the bill if you're looking for a way to numb yourself. There's also a comment that there were some emergency room healthcare professionals who were taking kids to see accidents that had happened as related to drunk driving as kind of a deterrent. And I hate to tell you, there's a lot of research that says scare tactics are not effective. You cannot scare a child. And I'm going to give you a really good example of how I know that this is true. And it's just one story, but trust me, there's research behind this that scare tactics with kids do not work. They don't think it's going to happen to them. They don't think they're effective. But here's the story I want to share. In 2010 or 11, I think it's 2011, there was a horrible car accident in the community where my kids grew up. And there were 20-year-old young men in the car, and 2 of them were killed. All 5 of these kids were my daughter's classmates. They were 2 years out of high school. This was in August. They were all home from college or wherever they were partying, wrapped their car around a tree, and 2 of them were killed. Kids were traumatized because they were trapped in this car, and this was in the day of flip phones. So they had phones with them. They were trapped in the car until jaws of life got them out of the car, and 2 of their friends were dead in the car, right? So exponentially number of kids, were impacted by this with the trauma of being on the phone with all of that. I can't even tell you what a horrific thing this was. The next week, they had a vigil for these kids at the spot where the accident happened, and then they tapped a keg. So they drank beer to numb themselves from what happened. They did not learn a really big lesson about never drinking underage. That's not what happened. So again, that's one story. And the principal of that high school is a friend of mine, and he said a week after that accident happened, the students had forgotten about it. Mind you, these guys were 2 years older, but they had siblings, they had friends. So unfortunately, that might be really effective for some people. The old crashed car at the high school front lawn isn't happening so much anymore, because we now know that it's not only is it not a deterrent, it can be incredibly triggering for somebody who's lost someone in a car accident, who has experienced some kind of trauma that this is reminiscent of. So we're learning a lot about prevention, and unfortunately, some of the things that we were very well intended in the past are just no longer understood to be helpful. So the person who's going to stay away from it anyway, that'll be a great reinforcement for them, possibly. But for the folks that we're really worried about who are at greater risk, it's not necessarily something that might be helpful. I don't know, Jill, if you had any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kim. And, especially with my background in juvenile justice, like, unfortunately, the scare tactics just don't work. I think you might have maybe 1 out of 10 people that could be impacted to where it's going to make a difference. But as adolescents, naturally, there is this, it's not going to happen to me kind of belief. And it's kind of like a narcissism that just naturally have as a teenager. You're kind of supposed to have it, but it doesn't help us in these situations where we're trying to teach lessons. And, I think, unfortunately, you see something that might impact somebody at the age of 10 is not probably going to impact them the same way at age 15. And it's going to have a different feel for them. So, because I also think that the kids are also getting into these situations where they are getting away with things. A dangerous situation did not result in something incredibly terrible. So it's like, oh, okay, that was fine. So I'm going to keep kind of like putting my toe in the water, or, touch the oven a little bit to see how bad it hurts me next time, until your hand is fully on that stove and your skin is bubbling. Like that's, I think, the mentality of a teenager. I have a similar experience, Kim, too. When I was a victim's advocate years ago, we had a case where I want to say it was like 5 kids got into this severe accident. They were all under the influence of marijuana. The driver of the vehicle reached down to get his phone, and basically the car, I think they hit an embankment. I want to say 2 kids died, and the other ones were like life flighted to the hospital. The ironic thing was, obviously we went through that whole court case, and there was a lot of tragedy involved with that. Very, very sad. Fast forward, when I was at rehab after school, working with adolescents, I also saw a few young adults. And sure enough, one of those kids that was a part of that whole accident came in for treatment and was being assessed. So, in that circumstance, that accident wasn't bad enough for that person to not engage in substance use past that point. Really, what it was, I think, is something that created even more of a substance use problem for him, because, to your point, Kim, like he was coping with something that was really, really tragic. So when you're in that space, it's just not the same. It's not what we would think, I think, logically. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. I know we're just about out of time, but I wanted to touch on one other question that had come in advance, and that was about peer pressure. And I think this is such a really great talking point, because it's the research is telling us it's not just peer pressure, it's actually just peer presence. So being with your peers who are engaging in activity, you want to be a part of that. So they don't even have to pressure you. It's just being around it that can make you feel inclined to do that. So there's that FOMO, fear of missing out, right? But there's some things that we can do to mitigate that, such as role playing, things like that. So like talking through our kids with like, okay, so if we think that our kids are not going to want to drink, we can say, let's talk about what will happen when you go to this party this weekend. You think there might be some alcohol, like you're a little worried about that, or, okay, well, let's talk through, like, let's pretend I'm offering you a drink. And if our kids don't feel like doing that with us, because I don't know if they would really want to do it with their mom or dad, maybe if they have a really good friend who's going to have their back, somebody that they're aligned with, they can say like, okay, let's go up in our room and like just kind of act this out, and just, that's experiential learning, right? I mean, this is just like thinking through what I'm going to say, practicing it, then it doesn't feel so foreign or uncomfortable to actually do that in the moment when this happens. But Jill or Heather, any other thoughts about peer pressure, or any other closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
Something either one of you said brought this up for me, was a memory of being in high school and babysitting for a family who used to take roadies with them, like a drink on the road. And I remember thinking like, wow, we're not supposed to do that. But I mean, it was like, so like, well, I guess it's okay. So it's just more of that, like, I think it's really important that we like notice the normalization of drinking, or, those behaviors.
Right. I never heard that term, roadies, other than people that carry equipment for bands.
Road soda.
Road soda, is that a
Road
thing?
soda, yeah. It's yep.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like what, to Heather's point a little bit, is that it's kind of just like the mentality and the modeling. It's just like I was saying earlier with the, what do you have in your mug on the sidelines at a soccer tournament? Totally see that. And I mean, I have a son that plays soccer and he's on the travel team, and we have tournaments that last all day long. And there are definitely bits and pieces of conversations around, oh, should we put something else in this next time? I'm like, please don't. Our kids do not need to see that. So I agree. I think so, peer pressure. And so, Kim, the only other thing that comes up for me, aside from what you talked about, is teaching our kids what good friends really are. What does it mean to have a healthy relationship with your peers? I think that is a huge thing to teach young, and talk about experiences that our children are actually having with other children, and talk through, what does this mean when this person says this or does this? What do you think this means? And what is someone that you want to spend your time with? How do you show that you can be a good friend? And then what do you expect from somebody in return? So when the peer pressure kind of stuff comes up and it's feeling like this person is almost trying to get me to do something that I know I shouldn't be doing, being able to stand up to that and saying, yeah, I'm good, thanks though, and not really worrying too much about what they're going to say or do or care. And, it's kind of like not addressing it when it's starting to be a thing, addressing it in a different way at a much earlier age.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's great stuff. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're a little past 8:30, so we're going to say good evening. But Heather and Jill, thank you so very much. You're both just terrific and great conversation. We could obviously talk about this a lot longer. So thank you everybody for being with us. I'm going to make sure that I think when this program ends, you'll see the survey come up. I think I have it. I can put it in the chat as well. Yep, here we go. So I'll drop this in the chat. This is the survey that you can take. There we go. Okay. So thank you, everybody. And you can follow up on that page that I shared with you earlier, conversation.zone/alcohol. The recording will be there tomorrow. But anyway, thank you again, Heather and Jill, and thanks everybody for being here.